Good day. Today we're going to talk about embedded firmware. The good, the bad, the ugly. And there's a lot of ugly to go around. All right, our agenda. First thing we're going to do is teach you that school is wrong. We're going to discuss the cost of code, what is good firmware, what is bad firmware, and some information about the firmware review process. So, first thing to realize is most of the stuff you've learned in school is wrong. The first thing is hard problems are worth more points. This may be true in school, but in the real world, easy problems are actually often worth more money than a hard problem. We learn in school that we can't copy someone else's work. This is not true again. Again, it's great to go and copy other people's work. Again, here only if the license agreement allows it. So, firmware or code that you find with the MIT license pretty much allows you to do almost anything. So, read the license and reuse work. Again, here, you must do your own work. Again, this is not true. You're allowed to get help from friends, colleagues, etc. So, when you come out of school and you think that, school's taught you a lot of stuff, remember, a lot of the stuff they teach you is incorrect. Okay. Let's discuss the cost of code. So, code being firmware, software, etc. So, how do you measure the cost of code? What is a good metric for code? So, one metric that you often will see is the lines of code. Like, how many lines of code do you write today? How many lines of code do you write a year? We can also say, how much does it cost to write a line of code? Generally, it's estimated that the cost is $20 to $40 per line of code. Space shuttle code costs $1,000 per line. And this is considered some of the best code ever written with a single bug and 400,000 lines of code. Now, Toyota has the most coveted award for the most expensive code ever written. Their engine control code caused the feds to hit them with a $1.2 billion fine. This worked out to be over $1,200 per line of code. That's just from the fines. That doesn't include the actual development and engineering cost. And note, the fine was for hiding how bad and the true cause of failures Toyota had. We'll discuss this in the next slide. So, Toyota had an unintended acceleration problem. Basically, their cars would start accelerating and they would not stop. You'd push on the brakes, let off the gas, it still kept trying to accelerate. This problem came to a head when a California police officer and his family died because of this, and he was on the phone with 911 explaining the problem. Other people had seen this problem and been in accidents, but the California Highway Patrol officer is a trained expert in driving and verified that what Toyota had said the problem was not the problem. And thus, government got involved, and Barr did some research on it and found all kinds of problems with the code. So, it was estimated that 41% of the stack was used by Toyota, but Barr showed over 94% was used. Code had recursive calls, which would flood the stack and kill it. No memory protection, no runtime stack measurement, litany of other faults were in there, unsafe casting, race conditions. They wrote their own RTOS and found that most RTOS errors were ignored and had a lot of MRSA C violations. Their watchdog was not implemented correctly, etc. And you are on the road with vehicles that had this bad code written in it. So Normally I would ask people sitting around the table, what is bad firmware? And so a lot of people have different opinions on what is good and bad firmware. And so let me explain what I think some bad firmware is. So let's start with on the firmware. Are you ready to review the firmware to determine if it's good or bad code? If you think you are, you're probably not. Here's some questions. What version of the compiler and tools are used? What are the requirements? Where's the software manual? So you cannot say code is good or bad without knowing the requirements of the code. There is a whole litany of other things involved in especially firmware. Like, is there a manual? How do you build the code? What are the options? Which version of the compiler should you use? Now, what is good firmware? Well, first of all, the firmware has to meet the requirements. Should it be easy to understand? Should it be well documented? Should it be bug-free? Should it have side effects? Others? So let's discuss these a little bit in detail for a firmware review process. If you don't have requirements, you obviously can't judge whether the firmware meets a requirement. If the firmware is not checked into version control, then are you really reviewing any firmware? Because you can never find it again. Does your firmware track the stack usage, the heap usage? Is the code reusable? Does it have bug tracking? Does it have global variables? These are a lot of the things that we typically look for in a code review. One of the things with code reviews is it's easy to point fingers and blame other people and talk about how bad their code is. However, no matter how bad their code is, you at some point will write worse code. You will ship worse code. When doing a code review, your job is not to insult the developer, but talk about the code and treat the code as a separate entity. And any time you're dealing with people, it's best to say I think and I feel versus using the word you. Try to avoid using the word you. Remember, you're reviewing the code, not the developer or programmer. To help you in your code review, the best thing to do is take one line at a time. Figure out what one line does and move forward. If you're not smart enough to understand the code you're trying to review, then who is? Most likely the author that wrote it is not that smart either. I personally know that if I look at code I've written 6 months ago, it's the same as looking at code that was written by a different developer. I remember nothing about the code, and I have to go back and relearn it all myself. So typically here I would open some code and walk through it. I will do this in another video, but for right now, we will go forward and we'll talk about firmware a bit more and writing firmware. Firmware. Writing code is like building a house. You don't want to build a house on a crumbling foundation. Just like building a house, you don't just come up to a site and start framing up walls. You make an architectural design for the house. You make the foundation where it can support things like reporting orders, be stable. You want to make sure no matter how much you do on the house, the foundation can support the load above it. Always learn from others, the good, the bad, the ugly. So, as a little side note, I supported my way through college by being an auto mechanic. So one day I bought an $800 Dodge Caravan. This Caravan had a 4-cylinder engine that was blown up. So I swapped it out with the V6 3.8 liter engine, new transmission, power seats, put power windows, tinted windows in it. When I was all done fixing up this Dodge Caravan, I had an $800 Dodge Caravan. No matter how much I polished that turd, it was still a turd. The lesson here is start with a quality foundation. When you're done, you will have something of quality. If you start with a poor foundation, when you're done, you're going to have something of poor quality. Thank you for your time, and please subscribe and listen for further videos, especially on code review.